The cold wind swept relentlessly over the quiet cemetery as the millionaire knelt beside a single worn gravestone. His hands trembled, not from the chill, but from the weight of unbearable loss crushing his soul. The roses he brought hung limp, the colors faded, like the memories he tried so desperately to hold on to. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're sitting alone tonight, holding onto a photograph, or remembering someone you used to know. It doesn't matter what time it is or what city you call home. But I promise you, the story I'm about to tell will reach deep inside you, stirring places you thought were long closed. In the heart of Chicago, where steel giants pierce the gray sky and the cold wind from Lake Michigan cuts through even the warmest coat, lived a man whose fortune was spoken of in hushed reverence across every major financial district in America. Henry Caldwell owned half the commercial real estate downtown, his investment portfolio spanning from cryptocurrency to government bonds, his net worth approaching 9 figures. Money flowed through his life like an endless river, stock dividends arriving monthly, business profits accumulating in offshore accounts, Bitcoin investments that had multiplied beyond his wildest calculations. But on this frozen February afternoon, as Henry pressed his forehead against the cold marble headstone, none of those assets mattered. Not the penthouse overlooking Grant Park, not the private jets, not the Swiss bank accounts holding millions in euros. All of it felt like worthless paper in the wind compared to the 6-year-old girl who would never again run through his front door calling his name. The headstone read simply, Emma Rose Caldwell, beloved daughter, too pure for this world. The date underneath, October 15th, marked exactly 6 months since the accident that had torn his universe apart, 6 months since the drunk driver had run that red light on Michigan Avenue. 6 months since Henry's entire reason for living had been ripped from his arms in a hospital room that smelled of disinfectant and broken dreams. The cemetery stretched endlessly around him, a field of stone monuments to loss, each marking someone's universe, collapsed. Henry came here every week, always bringing those same red roses Emma had loved, always staying until the groundskeepers began their evening rounds. The ritual had become his only anchor to sanity, the only time he allowed himself to feel anything at all. Henry Caldwell had built his empire from absolutely nothing. Born in a cramped apartment on the South Side, he'd clawed his way from poverty through sheer determination and an almost supernatural ability to predict market trends. By 30, he owned 3 restaurants. By 40, he controlled a chain of luxury hotels. By 50, his real estate investments stretched from California to New York, his stock portfolio diversified across every major industry. Financial magazines called him a genius. Business schools taught case studies about his unconventional strategies. But Emma had been his masterpiece, not the hotels, not the restaurants, not the millions in assets, his daughter. She was the one investment that had paid dividends in pure joy, the only return that had ever truly mattered. Emma, with her wild curls and infectious laugh, who would sit on his lap during video calls with investors, scribbling pictures on the back of important contracts, while Henry explained quarterly profit margins to men in expensive suits. She had been his light in a world grown increasingly cold and calculating. While other wealthy men collected cars or art, Henry collected Emma's drawings, framing them in his office between his Harvard MBA and his Wall Street Journal covers. She was the reason he'd softened his business practices, the reason he'd started donating to children's hospitals, the reason he'd remembered what it felt like to believe in something beyond profit and loss statements. The accident had happened on a Tuesday. Henry had been in a board meeting discussing a potential acquisition worth $50 million when his phone rang. The caller ID showed Emma's school. He almost didn't answer. The deal was too important, the investors too impatient. But some primal instinct made him step out of the conference room. The voice on the other end was gentle but devastating. There had been an accident. Emma had been walking to the school bus when a drunk driver, speeding through downtown traffic, had mounted the sidewalk. The impact was instantaneous. She never felt any pain, they assured him. She never knew what happened. Henry had collapsed right there in the hallway of his corporate headquarters, his knees hitting the marble floor as the phone slipped from his numb fingers. All around him, employees rushed past discussing market fluctuations and quarterly reports, completely unaware that Henry Caldwell's world had just ended. The acquisition fell through. The investors found other opportunities. None of it mattered anymore. In the months that followed, Henry's penthouse had become a shrine to stillness. The clocks throughout the apartment had stopped at 3:47 p.m., the exact moment Emma's heart had ceased beating in the trauma unit at Northwestern Memorial Hospital. Every photograph of her was carefully preserved under glass, as if exposure to air might somehow steal away what little remained of her presence. The windows stayed closed, sealing out the sounds of a city that had continued living while his daughter could not. His housekeeper, Mrs. Garcia, moved through the rooms like a ghost, dusting furniture that no one touched, preparing meals that Henry barely ate. She'd worked for the family since Emma was born, and her own grief hung heavy in the silence between them. They rarely spoke anymore. What was there to say? How could words acknowledge the magnitude of what had been lost? The business continued running on autopilot. Henry's assistant handled the meetings he could no longer bear to attend. His financial advisors managed the investments that no longer held any meaning. The money kept flowing. Dividends from tech stocks, rental income from his property portfolio, interest from municipal bonds. But it felt like blood money, compensation for a life he no longer wanted to live. Friends and business associates had tried to reach out in those first few weeks. They'd sent flowers and condolence cards, invited him to dinners and charity galas, anything to draw him back into the world of the living. But Henry couldn't bear their pitying looks, their careful words, their obvious relief that such tragedy had visited someone else's family instead of their own. Eventually, they stopped calling. Eventually, the invitations stopped coming. Even grief had its social expiration date. During the darkest nights, when sleep refused to come and the silence pressed against him like a physical weight, Henry would stand at his living room window looking out over Lake Michigan. The water stretched endlessly toward the horizon, dark and indifferent under the city lights. Sometimes he wondered what it would be like to simply walk into those cold depths, to let the numbness in his heart spread through his entire body until he could join Emma wherever she had gone. Only the thought of her disappointment, her gentle voice telling him to be strong, kept him tethered to a world that felt increasingly hollow. On this particular afternoon, clutching the same red roses that Emma had once helped him choose from the flower shop on State Street, Henry knelt beside her grave and tried to remember what her laugh had sounded like. The sound was fading from his memory, and that terrified him more than any business failure or financial loss ever could. He whispered her name into the winter air, a prayer to a God he was no longer sure was listening. The wind picked up, cutting through his expensive wool coat as if it were made of paper. Around him, the cemetery stretched in all directions, a city of the dead more peaceful than the city of the living he'd left behind. This was where Henry felt closest to Emma now, in this place where silence reigned and time moved differently. Here, he could almost pretend she was just sleeping, waiting for him to read her one more bedtime story. But today, something was different. As Henry arranged the roses against the frost-covered marble, he became aware of another presence in the cemetery. Soft footsteps crunched through the dry grass behind him, too light to belong to the groundskeepers, too purposeful to be accidental. He didn't turn around. He had no interest in well-meaning strangers offering empty platitudes about time healing all wounds, or Emma being in a better place. He'd heard every possible variation of comfort, and none of them had made the slightest difference. The footsteps stopped a few feet away, and in the corner of his vision, Henry caught sight of small shoes, worn sneakers with holes near the toes, clearly too thin for February in Chicago. Still, he didn't look up. He'd perfected the art of discouraging conversation, of projecting the kind of grief that warned others to keep their distance. But then a small voice spoke, gentle and clear as a bell in the winter air. A small hand appeared in his peripheral vision, placing something delicate beside Emma's headstone. Henry's breath caught in his throat as he finally looked up to see a little girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, with tangled chestnut hair escaping from a knitted cap that had seen better days. Her coat was threadbare, patched in several places, but her eyes held a warmth that seemed to radiate heat in the cold afternoon air. "I brought this for your little girl," the child said quietly, her voice carrying no fear despite standing before a stranger in an empty cemetery. She'd placed a single white flower beside his roses, a small wildflower that shouldn't have been blooming in February, shouldn't have survived the harsh Chicago winter, yet there it was, perfect and pure against the dark stone. Henry stared at the flower, then at the girl who'd brought it. "How did you—" His voice came out as a croak, unused to conversation for so long that the words felt rusty in his throat. "Who are you?" The girl tilted her head, studying him with the kind of directness that only children possessed. "My name's Lily. I live at the children's home on Ashland Avenue. I come here sometimes to visit the people who don't have anyone else." Her matter-of-fact tone suggested this was perfectly normal behavior, as if 9-year-olds regularly made their rounds through Chicago cemeteries, bringing comfort to strangers. "You shouldn't be here alone," Henry managed, though something about her presence felt anything but dangerous or inappropriate. There was an inexplicable sense of rightness about this moment, as if the universe had conspired to place this particular child in this particular spot at exactly the right time. Lily smiled, and Henry felt something shift in his chest, the first crack in the ice that had formed around his heart. "I'm not alone. I'm with you." She knelt down beside Emma's grave, her small hand tracing the letters carved into the stone. "Emma Rose Caldwell. That's a beautiful name." She must have been very special. The simplicity of the statement hit Henry like a physical blow. In all the months since Emma's death, everyone had spoken about her in past tense, using careful words like was and had been, as if acknowledging she'd existed might somehow make her loss more real. But this strange child spoke about Emma as if she were still present, still special, still worthy of love and remembrance. "She was everything," Henry whispered, the words escaping before he could stop them. "She was my whole world." Lily nodded solemnly. "I can tell. That's why the flowers grow here." She gestured to the small white bloom she'd brought. "Beautiful love makes beautiful things grow, even in winter, even in sad places." Henry looked at the impossible flower again, its petals pristine white against the gray February landscape. Everything in him wanted to dismiss this as coincidence, as childish imagination, as anything other than what it appeared to be. He was a rational man, a businessman who dealt in facts and figures and measurable returns on investment. Magic didn't exist in his world. Miracles were marketing terms used by lesser minds to explain lucky breaks in favorable market conditions. But sitting here in this cemetery, looking at this wild flower, blooming in defiance of winter, listening to this strange child speak about love making things grow, Henry found his certainty wavering. There was something about Lily that didn't fit into any category he understood. She radiated a kind of peace that seemed impossible for someone so young, especially someone living in a children's home, presumably without parents or family of her own. "How do you know about loss?" Henry found himself asking. "You're just a child." Lily's smile grew sad but never lost its warmth. "Everyone knows about loss. The difference is what you do with it. Some people let it make them hard. Other people let it make them soft. My mama taught me that before she went to heaven." The casual mention of her mother's death should have been heartbreaking, but Lily spoke about it with such acceptance that Henry felt his own grief shift slightly. Here was a child who'd experienced loss, who understood pain, yet somehow maintained hope. How was that possible? How could someone so young possess wisdom that had completely eluded him despite all his years and accomplishments? "I should go," Henry said abruptly, uncomfortable with the emotions this conversation was stirring up. He'd spent months carefully constructing walls around his heart, and this child was dismantling them with her simple presence. "Thank you for the flower." Lily stood up, brushing dirt from her worn jeans. "I come here every Tuesday," she said matter-of-factly. "Same time. If you ever want to talk about Emma, I'll be here." She started to walk away, then turned back with a smile that could have melted the ice on Lake Michigan. "She's proud of you, for coming here, for bringing those beautiful roses. Love doesn't end just because someone goes to heaven." And with that, she was gone, walking across the cemetery with the confident stride of someone who knew exactly where she belonged in the world. Henry sat alone beside Emma's grave, staring at the white flower that shouldn't exist, feeling something he hadn't experienced in 6 months, curiosity about tomorrow. For the first time since Emma's death, Henry Caldwell found himself looking forward to Tuesday. Henry spent the following week trying to convince himself that Tuesday afternoon in the cemetery had been an aberration. Perhaps grief had finally driven him to hallucination. He had read about such things happening to people devastated by loss. Maybe his mind had conjured up this mysterious child as a coping mechanism, a way to process emotions his rational business brain refused to acknowledge. But the white flower remained beside Emma's grave when he returned the next Tuesday, now pressed flat against the stone but still impossibly present. And Lily was there too, sitting cross-legged on the grass beside the headstone as if she'd been waiting for him. She wore the same threadbare coat, the same worn sneakers, but today she'd brought a small thermos of hot chocolate that steamed in the cold air. "I thought you might be cold," she said simply, offering him the thermos without any of the awkwardness that usually accompanied interactions between strangers. "Mrs. Patterson at the home makes it with real cocoa powder, not the instant kind." Henry accepted the warm container with hands that trembled slightly, not from cold this time, but from the overwhelming realization that someone had thought about his comfort, had planned ahead to offer him kindness. When was the last time anyone had done something purely for his benefit, without expecting anything in return? Even his business associates who called themselves friends had always wanted something: introductions, investments, recommendations. But this child offered warmth with no ulterior motive. "Tell me about Emma," Lily said, settling back onto the grass as if preparing for a long conversation. "What made her laugh?" The question caught Henry off guard. Everyone always asked how he was doing, how he was holding up, how he was managing his grief. No one had asked about Emma herself, about who she'd been when she was alive and vibrant and filling his world with joy. The business world had no template for discussing dead children, so his professional circle had simply avoided the topic altogether. "She loved terrible jokes," Henry found himself saying, surprised at how easily the words came. The worse they were, the harder she laughed. She collected joke books and would practice them on me during breakfast. The memory brought a ghost of a smile to his face. "What do you call a bear with no teeth?" "A gummy bear. She must have told me that one 100 times. Lily giggled, the sound bright and unexpected in the solemn cemetery atmosphere. "That's a good one. I bet she was really funny." She was. Henry took a sip of the hot chocolate, feeling its warmth spread through his chest. She wanted to be a comedian when she grew up, or a veterinarian, or the president, sometimes all three at the same time. "Dream big," Lily said approvingly. "That's what Mama always told me. Dreams don't cost anything, so you might as well make them huge." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, sharing the hot chocolate and listening to the wind rustle through the bare branches of the cemetery's oak trees. Henry found himself studying this strange child, looking for clues about who she was and where she'd come from. Her clothes were clean but clearly secondhand, mended with care but showing signs of hard wear. Her shoes were completely inappropriate for Chicago winter, offering no protection against the cold that seeped up from the frozen ground. Yet there was something about her that transcended her obvious poverty. She carried herself with quiet dignity, spoke with wisdom far beyond her years, and radiated a peace that Henry hadn't felt since before Emma's accident. In his business dealings, he had learned to read people quickly, to assess their motivations and reliability within minutes of meeting them. But Lily defied categorization. She existed somehow outside the normal parameters of his experience. "The children's home you mentioned," Henry said carefully. "How long have you lived there?" "About 2 years," Lily replied, without the bitterness he might have expected from an orphan child. "Since Mama got sick, she held on as long as she could, but sometimes heaven calls people home before we're ready to let them go." The matter-of-fact way she spoke about her mother's death reminded Henry of how Emma had once discussed difficult topics, with a child's acceptance of realities that adults struggled to comprehend. But where Emma's innocence had been protected by privilege and security, Lily's seemed forged by hardship, yet somehow unscarred by it. "And you just visit cemeteries regularly?" Henry asked, genuinely curious about this unusual habit. "Not all of them," Lily clarified. "Just this one. Mrs. Patterson says I have a gift for finding people who need company. She doesn't always approve, but she doesn't stop me either." She picked a blade of grass and twirled it between her fingers. "Lonely people have a certain look, like they're carrying something too heavy for just one person." Henry felt exposed, as if this child could see straight through the expensive suits and careful composure to the broken man underneath. "And you think I look lonely?" "I think you look like someone who forgot how to believe in good things," Lily said gently, "but also like someone who wants to remember again." The observation hit closer to home than Henry was comfortable admitting. In the month since Emma's death, he'd lost more than his daughter. He'd lost faith in the fundamental goodness of existence. The world had revealed itself to be cruel and random. A place where drunk drivers could destroy innocent lives, and all the money in the world couldn't protect the people you loved most. Before Emma, Henry had been optimistic despite his difficult childhood. He'd believed in the American dream, in hard work paying off, in the possibility of building something meaningful. His business success had reinforced that worldview. Every profitable quarter, every successful investment had been proof that good things happened to people who worked for them. But Emma's death had shattered that faith. If random tragedy could strike down a 6-year-old girl who'd never hurt anyone, if all his wealth and influence couldn't save the one person who mattered most, then what was the point of believing in anything? The universe had revealed itself to be fundamentally indifferent, and Henry had adjusted his expectations accordingly. Yet, sitting here with this strange child, listening to her speak about love and hope with such certainty, Henry felt the first stirrings of something he'd thought was dead forever. Maybe it wasn't faith exactly, but it was at least curiosity about the possibility of faith. Maybe there were mysteries his business-trained mind couldn't quantify or explain. "Why do you do this?" he asked. "Visit strangers in cemeteries, I mean. What do you get out of it?" Lily considered the question seriously, as if he'd asked about her philosophy of life rather than her unusual hobby. "When Mama was dying, a lot of people visited us. They brought food and flowers and sat with her when I was at school. They didn't have to do that. Most of them barely knew us, but they came anyway, just because Mama needed help and they could give it." She paused, watching a small sparrow hop between the headstones searching for seeds. "Mama said that's what love looks like in action, showing up for people who can't do anything for you in return. She made me promise to remember that, to be the kind of person who shows up." The simplicity of her explanation left Henry speechless. In his world, every action had an expected return. Every relationship was built on mutual benefit. The concept of pure altruism, of helping someone simply because they needed help, was so foreign to his experience that he almost couldn't process it. "But you're just a child," he protested. "You shouldn't have to take care of adults. That's supposed to work the other way around." Lily smiled with a wisdom that made her look far older than her years. "Love doesn't have an age limit. Besides, taking care of people makes me happy. It's like Mama's still alive when I do the things she taught me." They sat together until the afternoon light began to fade, and the cemetery groundskeepers started their closing rounds. As they prepared to leave, Lily reached into her coat pocket and pulled out another small white flower, identical to the one she'd brought the week before. "For next Tuesday," she said, placing it carefully beside Emma's headstone. "These grow in the little garden behind our home. Mrs. Patterson says they're called forget-me-nots. I think Emma would like that name." Henry walked to his car in a daze, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. He'd spent more time talking today than he had in weeks, and for the first time since Emma's death, he'd discussed her without feeling like his chest was being carved out with a knife. Instead, sharing those memories had felt almost healing. That night, alone in his penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, Henry found himself thinking about what Lily had said regarding love in action. He thought about the investors who'd dropped him after the accident, the friends who'd stopped calling when his grief became inconvenient, the business associates who'd written him off as damaged goods. None of them had shown up when he needed them most, but an orphan child from a struggling children's home had somehow found the time and energy to offer comfort to a stranger. She'd brought him hot chocolate and listened to stories about his daughter and shared wisdom about loss that his expensive therapists had never managed to convey. She'd shown up, consistently and without expectation of reward, simply because someone needed help. For the first time in months, Henry fell asleep without taking the prescription medication that usually silenced his racing thoughts. Instead, he drifted off thinking about Tuesday, about forget-me-nots, and about a little girl who seemed to carry sunlight in her pocket even in the depths of Chicago winter. Tuesday became the week's anchor point, the one appointment Henry never missed or rescheduled. His assistant learned not to book important meetings on Tuesday afternoons. His financial advisors grew accustomed to waiting until Wednesday for responses to urgent investment opportunities. Nothing, not potential billion-dollar acquisitions or emergency board meetings, could compete with his standing date in Graceland Cemetery. Lily appeared every week like clockwork, always with something small to share. Hot chocolate when the weather was bitter, wildflowers when the spring thaw began, stories about life at the children's home that painted pictures of resilience and hope Henry had forgotten could exist. She never asked about his wealth or his business empire. She showed no knowledge of or interest in his status as one of Chicago's most successful entrepreneurs. To her, he was simply Henry, a sad man who missed his daughter and needed someone to listen. Through these conversations, Henry learned that Lily's father had never been in the picture, that her mother had worked 3 jobs to keep them housed and fed before cancer stole her strength and eventually her life. He learned that the children's home where Lily lived was perpetually underfunded, that kids there wore donated clothes and ate meals stretched thin to feed too many mouths. Yet Lily spoke about her circumstances without self-pity, focusing instead on Mrs. Patterson's kindness, on friendships with other children who understood loss, on small daily joys that Henry had trained himself not to notice. One particularly warm April afternoon, as Chicago finally began to shake off winter's grip, Lily mentioned in passing that she'd been hungry for most of the week because the home's food budget had run short again. She said it casually, the way she might mention the weather, but Henry felt something twist in his stomach. Here was a child who spent her free time comforting grieving strangers, and she was going to bed hungry because the adults responsible for her care couldn't afford to feed her properly. That night, for the first time since Emma's death, Henry made a business call that had nothing to do with his own financial interests. He contacted his accountant and his lawyer, setting up an anonymous charitable trust to funnel money to Ashland Avenue Children's Home. Not enough to draw attention or raise questions about where the funding had come from, but sufficient to ensure that no child there would ever skip meals again. The strange thing was how good this felt. For months, his vast wealth had felt like a burden, a cruel reminder of how useless money was when it came to the things that truly mattered. But using his resources to help Lily and the other children gave his fortune purpose again. It wasn't bringing Emma back, but it was honoring the kind of person she'd been, someone who'd cared about fairness and kindness above all else. Spring melted into summer, and Henry found himself looking forward to more than just Tuesdays. His conversations with Lily had awakened something in him, a curiosity about the world beyond his grief. He began taking walks through Grant Park, noticing things he'd previously ignored: the laughter of children on playgrounds, the patient teaching of parents with toddlers learning to walk, the simple pleasure people took in sunshine after a long winter. His housekeeper, Mrs. Garcia, commented on the change with cautious optimism. "Mr. Henry," she said one morning while preparing breakfast he might actually eat, "you look more like yourself again." Henry understood what she meant. For so long he'd felt like a ghost, haunting his own life, going through the motions of existence without any real connection to the world around him. The man who'd built a business empire through sheer force of will had seemed to disappear entirely, replaced by someone who could barely manage the basic functions of daily living. But slowly, incrementally, that driven and purposeful person was returning, not the same as before, but somehow deeper, more aware of what truly mattered. The revelation came on a sweltering Tuesday in July. Henry arrived at the cemetery to find Lily sitting on their usual spot, but instead of her characteristic peaceful demeanor, she looked troubled. Dark circles under her eyes suggested she hadn't been sleeping well, and her usually pristine smile seemed forced. "Everything all right?" Henry asked, settling beside her on the grass that had grown lush and green around Emma's headstone. Lily was quiet for a long moment, unusual for someone who typically radiated quiet confidence. Finally, she looked up at him with eyes that seemed older than her years. "Mrs. Patterson says I might have to leave the home soon. There's a family in Rockford that wants to adopt me." Henry felt his chest tighten. Adoption should be wonderful news for an orphaned child, but something in Lily's tone suggested she didn't view it that way. That could be good, couldn't it? Having a real family again? "They seem nice," Lily said carefully, the kind of diplomatic response that adults give when they're trying not to hurt someone's feelings. "They have a big house and want to give me opportunities, dancing lessons and private school and—" "But," Henry prompted gently. Lily picked at the grass beside her, avoiding his eyes. "They want me to be different, more normal, I guess. Mrs. Patterson explained about my visits here, about the time I spend with lonely people, and they think it's unhealthy. They said children shouldn't worry about sad adults, that I need to focus on being a regular kid." The words hit Henry like a physical blow. The idea of Lily being forced to suppress her natural compassion, her remarkable ability to bring comfort to people in pain, seemed fundamentally wrong. It would be like asking the sun to shine less brightly or demanding that flowers apologize for growing. "When do you leave?" Henry managed to ask. "Next month if the paperwork goes through." Lily finally met his eyes, and Henry saw tears she was trying hard not to shed. "I'm grateful, really I am. I know having a real family is what's supposed to make children happy. But you'll miss this," Henry finished, understanding completely. "You'll miss helping people who need it." Lily nodded, a single tear escaping despite her efforts to remain composed. "I've been coming here for over a year now. I know which graves never get visitors, which people come here when they're having their worst days. There's Mr. Peterson who visits his wife every Friday, and Mrs. Chen who brings origami flowers for her son, and that young mother who lost her baby and can barely stand up from crying so hard." Henry had been so focused on his own grief that he'd never noticed the other mourners, but apparently Lily kept track of them all. She carried the weight of an entire community's sorrow, offering comfort wherever she could provide it. The thought of that compassion being redirected toward dance recitals and homework assignments seemed like a cosmic waste of resources. "Maybe the new family will understand," Henry offered weakly, though even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. People who viewed Lily's empathy as a problem to be fixed wouldn't suddenly embrace it as a gift to be nurtured. That night, Henry lay awake staring at the ceiling of his penthouse, his mind racing with possibilities he'd never allowed himself to consider. Over the past months, Lily had become far more than just a weekly appointment or a therapeutic conversation. She'd become the closest thing he had to family, the one person whose well-being mattered to him beyond his own grief. He thought about Emma, about how she would have loved having an older sister figure like Lily. He thought about his empty house, about rooms that could be filled with laughter again, about the possibility of being needed by someone who could benefit from his protection and resources. Most of all, he thought about what Lily had taught him about love in action, about showing up for people simply because they needed help. By morning, Henry had made a decision that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. He was going to apply to adopt Lily himself. The process turned out to be far more complicated than any business merger Henry had ever navigated. Despite his obvious financial qualifications, his net worth alone could have funded the entire children's home system for decades. Social workers questioned whether a recently bereaved single man was emotionally stable enough to raise a child. They worried about his motivations, wondering if he was trying to replace his deceased daughter rather than truly caring for Lily as an individual. Henry submitted to psychological evaluations, home inspections, character references, and financial audits that were more thorough than anything required for his business loans. He attended parenting classes alongside young couples and spent hours answering questions about his grief, his stability, and his long-term plans for providing a loving home environment. The most difficult part was explaining his relationship with Lily without sounding like an emotionally unstable man who'd formed an inappropriate attachment to a child. How could he make social workers understand that their weekly conversations had been therapeutic in ways that years of expensive counseling had never achieved? How could he convey that Lily's wisdom and compassion weren't things he wanted to exploit, but gifts he wanted to protect and nurture? Mrs. Patterson from the children's home became his strongest advocate. She'd witnessed their friendship develop over months and had seen how both Henry and Lily had flourished through their connection. "That little girl saved that man's life," she told the adoption committee firmly, "and I believe he could give her the kind of stable, loving home she deserves." Meanwhile, the family in Rockford grew impatient with the delays. They'd expected to finalize Lily's adoption by late summer, but the competing application had complicated matters significantly. Social workers had to evaluate which placement would truly serve Lily's best interests: the traditional two-parent family with children close to her age, or the grieving millionaire who offered financial security but came with obvious emotional complications. Through it all, Lily herself remained remarkably calm. During supervised visits with both potential families, she was polite and cooperative with everyone, but Henry could see the strain in her eyes. The uncertainty was taking its toll, and he felt helpless to protect her from the institutional processes that were determining her future. One evening in late August, as Henry sat in his study reviewing quarterly profit reports that no longer seemed important, his phone rang. The caller ID showed the adoption agency's number, and Henry's heart began pounding so hard he could barely hear his own voice as he answered. "Mr. Caldwell," came the social worker's professional tone, "we've reached a decision regarding Lily's placement." Henry closed his eyes, preparing himself for disappointment. He'd always been someone who won, who succeeded through determination and strategic thinking, but this situation had been largely out of his control. All he could do was wait and hope that bureaucrats who'd never met Emma would understand why saving Lily felt like honoring his daughter's memory. "The committee has decided to approve your application," the social worker continued, and Henry felt his knees go weak with relief. "Lily will be placed in your care beginning next week, with a 6-month probationary period to ensure the arrangement is working well for everyone involved." Henry tried to respond, to express his gratitude and relief, but found himself speechless. After months of numbness, after convincing himself that he'd never feel joy again, this news hit him like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. He was going to be Lily's father. This remarkable child who'd saved his life was going to become his daughter. "Mr. Caldwell?" The social worker's voice brought him back to the present. "Are you there?" "Yes," Henry managed, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I'm here. Thank you. Thank you so much." "There will be paperwork to sign and a formal transition period, but Lily's very excited. Apparently, she's been hoping for this outcome all along. After ending the call, Henry sat in his study for a long time, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what had just occurred. In the span of a single phone conversation, his entire future had transformed again. Instead of growing old alone in this cavernous penthouse, he would have a child to care for, to protect, to love. Instead of his wealth sitting idle in investment accounts, it would serve a purpose, providing for someone who could truly benefit from the opportunities it offered. He called Mrs. Garcia immediately to share the news, and her delighted shriek could probably be heard throughout the building. Then he began making lists, rooms to redecorate, schools to research, activities to explore. For the first time since Emma's death, Henry started planning for a future that felt worth living. But mostly, he thought about next Tuesday's visit to the cemetery. He would get to tell Emma about her new sister, about the extraordinary little girl who would be joining their family. He could almost hear Emma's excitement, could picture her planning all the things she would have taught Lily if she'd been here to do it in person. In a way, Emma was still teaching them both, through the love that had brought Henry and Lily together, through the hope that had survived even the darkest grief, through the reminder that families could be built from the most unexpected connections. Love didn't end when someone went to heaven, just as Lily had told him that first day in the cemetery. It simply found new ways to grow and flourish and heal the world's broken places. The day Lily officially moved into Henry's penthouse, Chicago was experiencing one of those perfect September mornings that made the city feel like the most beautiful place on earth. Lake Michigan sparkled under clear blue sky, and Grant Park below bustled with joggers and dog walkers enjoying the crisp air. Henry had spent the previous week transforming one of his guest bedrooms into a space appropriate for a 9-year-old girl, though he'd been careful not to make it too fancy or overwhelming. Mrs. Garcia had helped him shop for furniture and decorations, guiding him away from the expensive designer pieces he'd initially considered toward more practical, child-friendly options. The room now held a comfortable bed with a colorful quilt, a sturdy desk for homework, bookshelves waiting to be filled, and a window seat that looked out over the lake. They'd painted the walls a warm yellow that would glow like sunshine even on cloudy days. When Lily arrived carrying a single small suitcase containing everything she owned, Henry felt his heart clench at how little she had to show for 9 years of life. But her face lit up as she explored her new room, running her hands over the soft bedding and examining each carefully chosen detail. "It's perfect," she said simply, and Henry knew she meant it. In her time at the children's home, Lily had shared a room with 3 other girls and owned nothing that was truly hers alone. The concept of personal space and private ownership was still foreign to her, but she adapted with the same grace she'd shown throughout the adoption process. The first few weeks required adjustment for both of them. Henry had to relearn how to share his space and his routines with another person, while Lily had to adapt to life in a household with virtually unlimited resources. She was initially cautious about asking for anything, having spent years trained to minimize her needs and wants. When Henry took her shopping for school clothes, she gravitated toward the clearance racks and suggested buying only what was absolutely necessary. "Lily," Henry said gently, guiding her toward better quality options, "we can afford whatever you need, and quite a bit of what you want too. You don't have to choose the cheapest option anymore." But old habits died hard. Lily had learned to be grateful for any kindness shown to her, to never expect more than the bare minimum, to make herself as small and undemanding as possible. It broke Henry's heart to see how carefully she monitored his reactions, watching for signs that she was asking for too much or causing inconvenience. Gradually, though, she began to relax. She discovered that Henry genuinely enjoyed her company, that he looked forward to hearing about her day at her new school, that her presence in his home brought life and warmth he'd forgotten possible. Mrs. Garcia delighted in having a child to cook for again, preparing elaborate meals and teaching Lily family recipes passed down through generations. Their Tuesday visits to the cemetery continued, but now they felt different. Instead of two lonely people finding comfort in shared grief, they'd become a family ritual, a way of honoring Emma and the love that had brought them together. Henry told Lily stories about Emma's short life, sharing memories he'd hoarded like precious treasures. In return, Lily shared memories of her mother, and gradually they began creating new memories together. Henry enrolled Lily in the best private school his money could buy, but made sure to choose one known for nurturing character rather than just academic achievement. He hired tutors when she struggled with subjects that hadn't been prioritized at her previous schools, but also encouraged her natural gifts for music and art. Most importantly, he made it clear that her caring nature, the quality that had first drawn them together, was something to be celebrated rather than suppressed. The transformation in Henry himself was remarkable. Colleagues who hadn't seen him since Emma's death barely recognized the man who returned to active business involvement. While he'd always been successful, he'd also been driven by a kind of desperate hunger for more wealth, more properties, more proof of his worth in a world that had once dismissed him as a poor kid from the wrong side of town. Now his ambition felt more purposeful. He still made smart investments and profitable deals, but money had returned to being a tool rather than an end in itself. His Bitcoin portfolio continued growing exponentially. His real estate holdings appreciated steadily. His stock dividends provided more monthly income than most people earned in years. But these successes no longer defined him. Instead, they enabled him to give Lily opportunities he'd never dreamed of, and to support causes that aligned with the values she'd taught him. He established a scholarship fund for children aging out of the foster care system, ensuring they could attend college or vocational training regardless of their financial circumstances. He quietly provided funding for arts programs in struggling schools, remembering Lily's stories about classmates whose creativity bloomed when given proper outlets. He invested in companies developing affordable housing, understanding now how precarious life could be for families without sufficient resources. The most significant change was in how Henry approached relationships. Before Emma's death, his social circle had consisted primarily of business contacts and acquaintances who shared his wealth, but not necessarily his values. Most of these connections had evaporated during his months of grief, revealing themselves as superficial. Now, as he re-emerged into social life with Lily by his side, he gravitated toward different kinds of people. Through Lily's activities, he met other parents who prioritized their children's well-being over status or achievement. Through his charitable work, he connected with people who used their resources to address real problems rather than accumulating possessions for their own sake. These relationships felt more authentic than anything he'd experienced in his previous life, built on shared values rather than mutual benefit. One evening in early December, as Henry helped Lily with homework at the kitchen table while Mrs. Garcia prepared dinner, he realized how completely his life had transformed. The penthouse that had once felt like a mausoleum now hummed with conversation and laughter. The rooms that had echoed with silence now held the sounds of a child practicing piano, talking on the phone with friends, reading aloud from library books. "Dad," Lily said suddenly, the word still new enough to make Henry's heart skip a beat every time she used it. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Sweetheart?" Lily set down her pencil and looked at him with the serious expression she wore when approaching important topics. "Do you think Emma would like me?" The question nearly brought tears to Henry's eyes. He understood what Lily was really asking, whether accepting her into his heart meant betraying Emma's memory, whether there was room in his love for both daughters. "Lily," Henry said, reaching across to touch her hand, "Emma would have adored you. She would have thought you were the best big sister any little girl could ask for. You're exactly the kind of person she would have wanted to be when she grew up, kind and wise and brave." Lily smiled, the worry lines around her eyes smoothing away. "I wish I could have met her." "You would have been great friends," Henry assured her. "In fact, I think maybe you did meet her, in a way. That first day in the cemetery when you brought her that flower, I think she sent you to find me." I think she knew I needed you." It was a belief Henry had come to hold deeply, though he'd never voiced it before. The timing of Lily's appearance, her inexplicable wisdom, her ability to offer exactly what he'd needed when he'd needed it most. It all felt too perfectly orchestrated to be mere coincidence. Whether Emma had somehow guided events or whether the universe itself had conspired to heal their mutual wounds, he would never know. But he'd learned to accept mystery alongside certainty, to embrace faith even when he couldn't explain its workings. As winter settled over Chicago and they approached their first Christmas together, Henry felt a contentment he'd never imagined possible. Not the driving satisfaction of closing another profitable deal, but a quiet peace that came from knowing his life had purpose beyond personal achievement. He was raising a remarkable child who would grow up to make the world better. He was using his wealth to create opportunities for people who needed them. He was living the kind of life Emma would have been proud of. Christmas morning brought snow that blanketed the city in pristine white, transforming Chicago into a winter wonderland. Lily woke up early, as children do on Christmas, but instead of immediately running to see what gifts waited under the tree, she climbed into Henry's bed for their new tradition of watching the sun rise together over Lake Michigan. "Are you happy, Dad?" she asked, snuggled against his side as they watched the sky lighten. "Happier than I ever thought I'd be again," Henry answered honestly. "Are you?" Lily considered the question with characteristic thoughtfulness. "I miss Mama sometimes, and I wish I could have known Emma, but I love being part of a family again. I love having someone who worries about me and wants good things for me." "You'll always be part of this family," Henry promised. "No matter what happens, no matter how old you get, you'll always be my daughter." They spent Christmas Day quietly, just the three of them if you counted Mrs. Garcia, who'd become as much family as employee over the years. They opened presents and cooked together and called other children from the home to wish them well. In the afternoon, they visited Emma's grave, bringing fresh flowers and telling her about their first Christmas together. As they stood in the peaceful cemetery, Henry reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he'd been a broken man who'd lost faith in everything meaningful. His vast fortune had felt like a burden, his future like an endless tunnel of grief and isolation. He'd been wealthy beyond most people's dreams, but spiritually bankrupt, successful by every external measure, but fundamentally lost. Now he stood with his daughter, because that's what Lily was, regardless of genetics or law, feeling richer than any portfolio balance could measure. He'd learned that money was only valuable when it served love, that success meant nothing without someone to share it with, that the greatest investments were the ones that couldn't be quantified on any balance sheet. The white flowers Lily had first brought to Emma's grave had multiplied, spreading into a small garden around the headstone. Mrs. Garcia said, "Forget-me-nots were aggressive spreaders, likely to take over the entire area if left unchecked." Henry decided he liked that symbolism, love expanding beyond its original boundaries, memory growing rather than fading, beauty emerging from places of pain. "Ready to go home?" he asked Lily as the winter sun began to set, painting the snow in shades of gold and pink. Lily nodded, taking his hand as they walked back to the car. Ready to go home. 5 years later, on a warm Tuesday afternoon in May, Henry sat in the same spot where he'd first met Lily. But everything else had changed. At 14, Lily had grown into a remarkable young woman who combined her natural compassion with the confidence that came from knowing she was loved unconditionally. She still visited the cemetery regularly, but now she came with friends from her volunteer work at the Children's Hospital, teaching them how to offer comfort to people experiencing loss. Henry's hair had gone completely silver, and lines around his eyes spoke of laughter as much as sorrow. His business empire continued to thrive, but these days he spent more time on philanthropy than profit margins. The charitable foundation he'd established in Emma and Lily's names had touched thousands of lives, providing scholarships, funding medical research, and supporting programs that helped vulnerable children find stable, loving homes. "Dad, look at this," Lily said, kneeling beside Emma's grave where the forget-me-nots had indeed spread into a beautiful garden of white and blue flowers. "She's written to you." Lily held a letter that someone had left wedged between the flowers, addressed simply to Emma's father. Henry opened it with trembling hands, wondering who might have left such a thing. "Dear Mr. Caldwell," the letter began in shaky handwriting, "you don't know me, but I wanted to thank you for what your foundation did for my grandson. Tommy was in foster care for 3 years after his parents died, and the scholarship you provided gave him a chance at college. He's studying to be a teacher now, planning to work with kids who've experienced trauma. He says he wants to give back the way someone gave to him. I thought you should know that Emma's love is still growing, still changing lives. A grateful grandmother, Margaret Peterson." Henry felt tears blur his vision as he read the letter. Emma had been gone for over 5 years now, but her impact continued to ripple outward through the foundation, through Lily's presence in his life, through the countless people their story had touched. Love didn't end when someone went to heaven. It just found new ways to flourish. "She would be so proud of us," Lily said softly, settling beside him on the grass that had grown lush around Emma's grave. "She would be proud of you," Henry corrected. "You're everything she would have wanted to become, brave and kind and determined to make the world better." Lily leaned against his shoulder, and Henry marveled at how perfectly she fit there, how natural it felt to be her father despite their unconventional beginning. Their family had been born from loss and grief, but it had grown into something beautiful and strong and full of purpose. As they sat together in the peaceful cemetery, Henry thought about all the broken people who'd found their way to this place over the years. Some came weakly, like he once had, trapped in cycles of grief that felt impossible to escape. Others visited rarely, driven by guilt or obligation rather than love. But increasingly, people came to Emma's grave because they had heard about the flowers, about the possibility of hope blooming in unexpected places. Mrs. Patterson from the children's home still sent him updates about kids she thought might benefit from the Foundation's programs. Social workers knew to contact him when they had difficult placements that required patience and resources. Teachers reached out when they had students whose potential was being limited by circumstances beyond their control. Henry's wealth had found its purpose in creating opportunities for people who needed them most. But more than the money, more than the programs and scholarships and foundation work, Henry knew his greatest legacy would be Lily herself. She was living proof that love could triumph over loss, that family could be chosen as well as born, that the most broken hearts could learn to heal when touched by grace. "Next week is graduation," Lily said, interrupting his reverie. "Will you be there?" "Wouldn't miss it for the world," Henry promised. "You know I'm proud of you, don't you? Not just for your grades or your achievements, but for who you are as a person." Lily smiled. The same radiant expression that had first caught his attention in this cemetery all those years ago. "You taught me that success doesn't mean anything if you don't have people to share it with." "No," Henry corrected gently. "You taught me that. You and Emma both." As they prepared to leave, Henry noticed a new visitor approaching Emma's grave, a young father with a toddler in his arms, both of them looking lost and overwhelmed. The man's eyes held the particular emptiness that Henry recognized from his own reflection during those dark months after Emma's death. "Daddy," the toddler said in a small voice, "where is Mommy?" Henry felt his heart clench with familiar pain, remembering his own desperate need for answers that would never come. But instead of the hopelessness that such scenes once triggered, he felt moved to action. This was what Lily had taught him about love in practice, showing up for people who needed help, offering comfort without expectation of reward. "Lily," Henry said quietly, "I think someone needs us." Lily followed his gaze and immediately understood. Together, they approached the grieving father, offering the same gift that had once been given to Henry, the simple presence of people who understood loss and could testify to the possibility of survival. "I'm Henry," he said gently, extending his hand to the stranger, "and this is my daughter Lily. We're sorry for your loss." The man looked up with eyes full of tears he was trying not to shed in front of his child. "Sarah," he managed, "my wife. She was everything to us." "I know," Henry said with the authority of someone who'd walked this path before. "And I know it feels impossible right now, but you're not alone." Over the next hour, Henry and Lily sat with this father and son, listening to stories about Sarah, offering practical advice about grief counseling and support groups, and most importantly, bearing witness to their pain without trying to fix it or explain it away. They shared their own story, carefully, appropriately, not to compare losses, but to demonstrate that healing was possible even after the most devastating grief. When they finally left the cemetery that day, Henry felt the same sense of completion that had sustained him through the darkest periods of his own recovery. This was his purpose now, not just accumulating wealth or achieving success, but using his experience to help others navigate their own journeys through loss and toward hope. "That's what love looks like in action," Lily observed as they walked to the car. "Your mother taught you well," Henry replied, "both of your mothers." 10 years had passed since that first encounter in Graceland Cemetery, and on this particular Tuesday in late October, Henry walked among the headstones with a slower step, but a heart that carried 10 years' worth of accumulated joy alongside its eternal sorrow. Lily, now 24 and finishing her master's degree in social work, walked beside him carrying her own bouquet of forget-me-nots, which she'd learned to cultivate in the small garden she maintained at their home. The cemetery had become something of a pilgrimage site for families who'd heard their story through the various media coverage of the foundation's work. Every week, Henry would find small tokens left at Emma's grave, handwritten notes from parents who'd lost children, photographs of families reunited through adoption programs, flowers from strangers who'd found hope in the midst of their own darkness. Today was special, though. Today marked not just their weekly visit, but the 10th anniversary of the Emma Rose Foundation, which had grown from Henry's modest anonymous donation to become one of the most respected children's charities in the Midwest. The foundation now operated programs in 12 states, had facilitated over 3,000 adoptions, and had provided educational scholarships to more than 5,000 children aging out of foster care. "Dad, look," Lily said, gesturing toward Emma's gravesite, which had been transformed over the decade into a small memorial garden that served as the unofficial spiritual center of their charitable work. Someone had left a large arrangement of roses, not the red ones Henry always brought, but yellow ones, bright as sunshine against the October morning sky. A card attached to the arrangement read, "For Emma Rose, who taught us all that love grows strongest in the darkest places. With gratitude from the Miller family, David, age 16, Susan, age 14, and James, age 12, adopted siblings who found each other through the Emma Rose Foundation." Henry's eyes filled with tears as he read the card. He remembered the Miller children well, 3 siblings who'd been separated in the foster system for nearly 4 years before the Foundation's family reunification program had managed to place them together with adoptive parents who could handle the complex needs of older children with trauma histories. The last he'd heard, all 3 were thriving in school, and David had received an early admission letter to Northwestern University. "Emma would love knowing her name is helping keep families together," Lily said softly, adding her forget-me-nots to the growing collection of flowers around the headstone. "She's probably organizing playdates in heaven," Henry replied, the gentle humor that had slowly returned to his conversations about Emma over the years. "Remember how she used to plan elaborate tea parties for her stuffed animals? I bet she's got all the children up there involved in some kind of complicated game." They sat on the stone bench that had been installed beside the grave 5 years earlier, funded by donations from families who'd benefited from foundation programs. Henry reflected on how dramatically his understanding of wealth had evolved over the past decade. At the height of his pre-Emma business success, he'd measured worth in terms of asset accumulation and quarterly profit growth. Now, sitting beside his daughter's grave with his adopted daughter beside him, he measured wealth in terms of lives touched, families healed, and hope restored. The Bitcoin investments he'd made in the early 2010s had appreciated so dramatically that he'd had to hire an entire team of financial advisors just to manage the philanthropic giving. His real estate portfolio had expanded to include affordable housing developments in 6 cities. His business investments now prioritized companies that aligned with his values: clean energy, educational technology, medical research focused on childhood diseases. But the most valuable investment he'd ever made couldn't be measured in any currency. It was the decision to open his heart to Lily, to risk loving again after losing everything. That investment had paid dividends in ways no financial advisor could have predicted. Lily had not only survived her difficult childhood, but had transformed it into motivation for helping others. Her master's thesis focused on developing innovative therapeutic approaches for children in foster care, combining traditional counseling techniques with structured volunteer opportunities that allowed kids to help others while processing their own trauma. Several universities had already reached out about faculty positions, and there was talk of her research being implemented in foster care systems nationwide. "I've been thinking about something," Lily said, pulling Henry's attention back to the present moment, "about expanding the Foundation's work." "Oh?" Henry asked, always interested in Lily's ideas. Over the years, many of the Foundation's most successful programs had originated from her insights about what vulnerable children actually needed, rather than what well-meaning adults thought they needed. What if we started a program specifically for kids who age out of foster care but don't go to college? Not everyone is cut out for higher education, but they still need support transitioning to independence. We could partner with trade schools, apprenticeship programs, maybe even help some of them start their own small businesses. Henry smiled, recognizing the same compassionate pragmatism that had first drawn him to Lily all those years ago. She had an uncanny ability to identify gaps in existing support systems and develop creative solutions that addressed real rather than theoretical needs. "That's brilliant," he said. "Write up a proposal and we'll present it to the board next month. I have a feeling Mrs. Patterson would love to be involved in something like that." Mrs. Patterson, now in her 70s but still running the Ashland Avenue Children's Home, had become one of the Foundation's most trusted advisors. She had an almost supernatural ability to identify which kids had the potential to thrive if given proper support, and which intervention strategies were most likely to succeed in specific situations. As they walked back toward the cemetery entrance, Henry noticed a familiar figure approaching along the gravel path. It was Dr. James Chen, the grief counselor who'd helped Henry navigate the darkest months after Emma's death. Dr. Chen had become not just a professional colleague, but a friend, serving on the Foundation's board and providing guidance for their family support programs. "Henry, Lily," Dr. Chen called out as he approached. "I hoped I might find you here today." "James," Henry replied, genuinely pleased to see his friend. "What brings you to the cemetery on a Tuesday afternoon?" "I wanted to tell you in person about something remarkable that happened in my practice this week," Dr. Chen said, his face lighting up with the kind of joy that only came from witnessing human resilience in action. "Do you remember Maria Santos, the young mother who lost her 8-year-old daughter in that car accident about 2 years ago?" Henry nodded. Maria's story had been particularly heartbreaking. A single mother working 2 jobs to support her daughter, whose life had been destroyed by another drunk driving incident. The Foundation had helped cover funeral expenses and provided counseling support, but Maria had struggled with severe depression and had been unable to return to work for months. "She came to see me yesterday," Dr. Chen continued. "She's doing remarkably well now, and she wanted to do something meaningful with her survival. She's starting a support group for parents who've lost children to drunk drivers, and she wants to partner with the Foundation to provide resources and meeting space." "That's wonderful news," Lily said immediately. "Peer support groups can be so much more effective than traditional counseling for some people." "That's exactly what Maria said," Dr. Chen agreed. "She specifically mentioned how much your story had inspired her when she was in her darkest place." She said knowing that you two had found a way to transform grief into hope gave her permission to imagine that healing might be possible for her too. Henry felt the familiar warmth that always accompanied news about the ripple effects of their work. In the early years of the foundation, he'd been focused on direct service, providing scholarships, facilitating adoptions, funding specific programs. But increasingly, he'd come to understand that their greatest impact might be in modeling what recovery could look like and demonstrating that devastating loss didn't have to mean the end of joy or purpose. "We'd love to support Maria's group," Henry said. "Have her call Lily next week and we'll figure out the details." After Dr. Chen left to visit his own family's gravesite, Henry and Lily continued their walk through the cemetery, following the pattern that had become their Tuesday tradition. They stopped at several other graves, people they'd met over the years who'd become part of their extended family of loss and healing. There was Mrs. Anderson, the elderly woman who'd visited her husband's grave every day for 15 years until her own death 3 years ago. Her granddaughter now brought her children to play among the headstones while she tended both graves, teaching them about the grandfather they'd never met and the great-grandmother who'd loved them fiercely. They paused at the grave of Marcus Thompson, a teenager who died in a gang shooting after aging out of foster care without sufficient support. His death had motivated the foundation to develop their first program specifically focused on helping 18-year-olds transition to independence, and hundreds of young people had been served by programs created in his memory. Near the back corner of the cemetery, they found the newest addition to their Tuesday journey, the grave of Sarah Martinez, the young mother whose husband and toddler they'd comforted 6 months earlier. Sarah had lost her battle with cancer, but the foundation had been able to help her husband, Marcus, and their son establish a stable living situation and connect with ongoing support services. Marcus still brought little Miguel to visit sometimes, and the 3-year-old had developed the habit of leaving small toys at various grave sites, apparently having decided that the people buried there might enjoy some entertainment. "I've been thinking about something else too," Lily said as they walked back toward Emma's grave for their final goodbye of the day. "What's that, sweetheart?" "I think it's time for me to start visiting cemeteries in other cities, the way I used to do here, just being present for people who need comfort. I know the foundation keeps me busy, but this direct work, this person-to-person connection, I think that might be how I can honor Mama's memory best." Henry stopped walking and turned to look at his daughter, struck by the magnitude of what she was proposing. At 9 years old, Lily had wandered through Graceland Cemetery offering flowers and comfort to strangers because it felt like the right thing to do. Now, as a trained social worker with advanced degrees and professional credentials, she wanted to return to that fundamental act of service. "That's a beautiful idea," he said finally. "Maybe we could develop it into a formal program, train volunteers to provide that kind of presence in hospitals, funeral homes, cemetery sites. Not therapy exactly, but just witness, companionship." "Mama used to say that sometimes people don't need to be fixed. They just need to be seen," Lily recalled. "Maybe that's what we've been learning all along, that the most powerful interventions aren't complicated programs or large donations. Sometimes they're just small acts of showing up." As they reached Emma's grave for their final goodbye, Henry placed his hand on the sun-warmed marble of her headstone and felt the familiar bittersweet mixture of sadness and gratitude that had become his permanent emotional landscape. Emma would have been 16 now, probably driving him crazy with requests to borrow the car and spend time with friends. She might have been thinking about colleges, dating, developing her own dreams for the future. But in a way that Henry couldn't fully explain but had learned to accept, Emma's legacy had grown beyond what any 16-year-old could have accomplished in life. Through her death, she'd brought Henry and Lily together. Through their healing, they'd created a foundation that had touched thousands of lives. Through their example, they'd given hope to countless families facing their own dark nights of the soul. "See you next Tuesday, baby girl," Henry whispered to the headstone, the ritual words that had anchored his week for a decade. "Tell Mama I love her," Lily added, as she always did. As they walked back to the car, Henry realized that he no longer thought of these cemetery visits as endings to his week, but as beginnings. Every Tuesday conversation beside Emma's grave renewed his sense of purpose and reminded him of the vast network of love and support that had grown from the smallest seed of connection between a grieving father and a compassionate child. The sun was setting over Lake Michigan as they drove home, painting the Chicago skyline in shades of gold and crimson. In the distance, Henry could see the lights beginning to flicker on in the penthouse that had once felt like a mausoleum, but now served as headquarters for their growing family's mission of hope. Mrs. Garcia would have dinner waiting, probably something elaborate that Lily had requested after remembering a dish from her early childhood. There would be phone calls to return from foundation staff, emails from families seeking assistance, reports to review about program outcomes. The work of healing the world's broken places never ended, but Henry had learned to find joy in the endless nature of the task rather than feeling overwhelmed by it. Tomorrow, he would wake up knowing that his wealth had purpose, that his success served love, that his life had meaning beyond any achievement he could have imagined in his pre-Emma days. Tomorrow, he would continue the work of honoring his daughter's memory by making sure other children had the support they needed to survive their own dark places. But tonight, he would simply be grateful for the impossible gift of this family built from loss, this love that had grown from the darkest soil, this hope that had somehow bloomed in a cemetery on a cold Tuesday afternoon when a 9-year-old girl had the courage to offer a flower to a stranger. And you? Have you ever met someone small who changed your life in an immense way? Have you experienced the kind of loss that makes you question everything you thought you knew about the world? Maybe you're sitting alone tonight, wondering if healing is possible. If hope can bloom again in the darkest places of your heart. I want you to know that Henry and Lily's story isn't fiction. It's happening every day in countless variations around the world. Broken people are finding wholeness through unexpected connections. Children are teaching adults about resilience and grace. Love is proving stronger than loss over and over again. The Emma Rose Foundation is real, and organizations like it exist in every city, staffed by people who understand that sometimes the greatest wealth can't be measured in dollars but in human connections restored. Sometimes the most successful investments aren't in stocks or real estate, but in the radical act of showing up for people who need to know they're not alone. If this story has touched something in you, if it's reminded you that miracles can come disguised as ordinary moments in cemetery grounds or children's homes or hospital waiting rooms, please share it with someone who needs to believe in hope again. Leave a like if you believe in the power of love to transform even the most wounded hearts. Subscribe so these messages of healing and redemption can reach other souls searching for light in the darkness. Because sometimes the deepest wounds are healed not by time or medicine or money, but by the simplest gifts, flowers placed by small hands, stories shared in quiet moments, and the faithful presence of someone who chooses to love us back to life. Sometimes the greatest fortunes are built not from Bitcoin portfolios or real estate empires, but from the courage to open our hearts after they've been completely shattered. And maybe, just maybe, you're one small act of kindness away from discovering that you too have the power to plant flowers in the graveyards of someone else's life, to offer hope where none seemed possible, to prove once again that love never truly ends. It just finds new ways to bloom.